For the first time, Africans were coming together as one to say, we are taking responsibility for our climate agenda.
The reality, of course, is that Africa is home to tremendous potential, and the focus was very much on highlighting that and communicating not just across Africa, but to the world.
The Africa Climate Summit in 2023, in my view, was a useful opportunity for the African continent to speak with a common voice and come to some understandings about what was most important to the continent and its people.
They really elevated the issue of making sure we hold the global community accountable in terms of making sure we are tracking the pledges of climate finance that needs to come to this region to finance the energy transition.
Well, I think the highlight of the Africa Climate Summit for me was that for the first time, Africans were coming together as one to say, we are taking responsibility for our climate agenda. We're also taking responsibility for the funding flows for climate, and we're speaking with one voice and telling the world we are aware that we have power in this dialogue. And I commend the people of Kenya and President Ruto for actually taking a stand as a very visible leader in this space. Because I have been to one COP before, the one in Egypt, and I still felt that even though it was hosted in Egypt, we did not have a clear, united voice. And that's why the Africa Climate Summit was so relevant. Now, for the average African, why does it matter? It matters because you are affected by climate change on a daily basis. Your lives are affected. Your health is affected. The food you consume is affected, right? Your livestock is affected. So every aspect of your life is being affected in one way or another from climate change. And we're seeing it in health indicators. We're seeing it in the cost of food, which I've described. We're seeing it in the destruction of infrastructure. And I could go on and on. So you have a role as an African to demand for the support you require to live your best life in spite of, and to build the resilience that we need so that our lives are not daily overturned because of climate disasters. And so for me, that was really a great outcome. Now, the skepticism that we often get from African man on the street or woman on the street is, so where is the funding going to come? How is it going to come into my pocket? I've just been displaced by floods. How am I going to live? And the challenge for us, and this is why this summit is really important, is to say, yes, there were commitments made by governments, local, regional, and international. Now, you have a right to demand for updates on what has happened since the climate summit. You have a right to also hold governments accountable for how they utilize the funds if they have been received. Like the loss and damage fund, we keep on talking about it. What percentage has come into the coffers, and what percentage has been trickled down into our countries, and how is that funding trickling down to the masses on the street, on the ground? And for me, the Kenyans are complaining about the recent rains, and I told them from my experience in Nigeria, they're only going to get worse. So we have to be prepared as people, number one, to say, let's invest in the right climate smart infrastructure because climate change is upon us. And let's also build our knowledge and awareness, but also demand that our governments tell us so we can prepare. So there are rains coming. In other parts of the world, you get a text message saying there's going to be a flash flood. If you're in this low-lying area, in these zip codes or in these regions, please evacuate, right? So our telcos have to partner with our community groups, have to partner with, everybody has a cell phone. How is that information getting out there? We owe it to our citizens to protect them. So I think as an ambassador, I would say that you as a citizen have power. You have power. You have the power to ask questions. You have the power to get the right information, to challenge your regional and local governments to do what they're supposed to do to protect you. And you have the power to vote who is going to support you as climate change is upon us on the African continent and affects us on a daily basis.
The first Africa Climate Summit, it's important to say, look, there are many ways you can look at this. My big takeaway from the ACS 2023 is that for the first time, we saw Africa come together in a coordinated confident manner to address the question of how do we respond to this challenge of climate change and climate action. And the key takeaway is that the narrative was very much in focus in Nairobi. The narrative around Africa is often that the continent cannot and will not be able to muster the resources to meaningfully address climate change. The reality, of course, is that Africa is home to tremendous potential, and the focus was very much on highlighting that and communicating not just across Africa but to the world that this is a continent that is not just a victim of climate change. It is a very important part of the solution, and that is a big step from where we have been in the past.
Unfortunately, even though my colleagues were able to make it, my colleagues from Arthur Energy Advisors were able to make it, I was unable to, and I have a small bit of regret about that. But in converging on Nairobi, I think it was linked to the COP in terms of a framework of opportunities for the African continent to get together in order to engage in the climate policy process, as it were, and to engage more in a more coordinated sense with what was emerging as the primary framework tool for engaging with climate. And with that as a backdrop, I think the Africa Climate Summit in 2023 was important towards the African continent sort of coming up with a more common voice about how we wanted to engage, how the African continent and its peoples and its representatives really wanted to engage via the African Union, among the other key contributors, to engage with COP as a framework for really trying to engage with the climate conversation and get some of the positions moving forward. COP had previously been happening for 28 sessions, 27 sessions before last year. And the progress that had been made was not nearly as significant or as fast as to deal with the 1.5 degree issue. And so the Africa Climate Summit in 2023, in my view, was a useful opportunity for the African continent to speak with a common voice and come to some understandings about what was most important to the continent and its people.
And when we look at the African Climate Summit, I think the outcomes there that were particularly interesting for built environment practitioners is the focus on a just energy transition. Being from South Africa, we know that 70% of the energy generation in this country is comes from coal. So coal is very much linked to the livelihoods of local communities. And so the focus on just energy transition at the COP28 means that we will really take into account the impact of energy transition on these communities. So the other thing that I thought was particularly interesting from these climate negotiations, this is the African Climate Summit specifically, is the Global Community Pledge. So what you have is we've been having a series of COPs. I think we are on the 28th COP. Last year was the 28th COP. And the global community has been making pledges around loss and damage, around directing climate finance to the African region. And so when the African Union convened the ACS in Nairobi last year, they really elevated the issue of making sure we hold the global community accountable in terms of making sure we are tracking the pledges of climate finance that needs to come to this region to finance the energy transition. So I thought that was a key outcome that came from those from the Nairobi Declaration on climate change that was convened by the African Union. When you look at how the ACS was convened just before COP and making sure that all the 54 member states met and agreed on specific policies, specific priorities, key priorities for the region, I think it meant stepping into a platform like a COP where we are negotiating with other countries around the globe. We were in a much stronger position as a continent because we were speaking with one voice. So I do believe it left the African continent in a much better position. But I think the challenge that remains is for us to follow up on a lot of the the commitments that were made at COP28, like many COPs. But for starters, we are singing from the same hymn sheet.